Hello and welcome to my second video on party roles in Dungeons & Dragons. In the previous video, took a look at the influence of the roles from AD&D, or if you prefer, like original D&D, on current Dungeons & Dragons. And these roles, of course, were the classic fighter, magic user, cleric, and thief. And in this episode, we'll take a look at the party roles in terms of the holy MMO Trinity of tank, healer, and DPS. And the influence for this is, of course, primarily from World of Warcraft, kind of the best known MMO that really cemented in these roles. Now, in World of Warcraft and many MMOs, you got to play that. It's a video game, and if you like try to run a instance at your level, like a dungeon, and you're like, hey, let's do it without a tank, and let's do it without heroes, just all go DPS, you'll get destroyed. But what about in tabletop D&D? One obvious answer is tabletop D&D is not a computer game. The DM and the players can work on anything, so you could create any kind of game you want. But let's take a look at these roles and how they might kind of work in D&D, and we'll begin, of course, with the role of the tank. So suppose you want to tank for whatever reason. Now, the way I'll go through this discussion is I won't assume any homebrew, put together new sets of rules to handle this. Just in vanilla, D&D, would tanking work? Can you go into the game and say, hey, I'm gonna tank just using existing rules? So the two main things of tanking are aggro. Essentially, you're gonna draw fire. The whole point of the tank is you're taking the damage for the rest of your team as much as possible. The second thing, of course, is since you're pulling all that damage, is not dying. That's survival. So in D&D, using the standard rules, could you tank? In terms of aggro, the rules don't offer a lot in the tanking toolkit. Games like World of Warcraft have these aggro tables and threat generation, and so you have abilities specifically designed to draw aggro on you, and for other characters to reduce their aggro. In terms of the vanilla rules, very little here. For example, the paladins have the compelled duel that essentially imposes disadvantage if you succeed in affecting an enemy. They have disadvantage to attack everyone else, and they can attack so to encourage them to attack you. They can, of course, just choose to ignore attacking you in the sense that although they'll take disadvantage, they could still do that. And if they're a caster, for example, they could do things that require saving throws and attack rolls and be kind of unaffected. And there's no mechanism that just forces enemies to only attack you. I mean, you could probably cobble together something with various spells to get them to come after you. But in terms of the general rules, there's not really a consistent mechanism for making everything or most things come after you. Now, of course, you can kind of generate aggro through, role playing. You could be, you basically try to provoke the enemy to attacking you, and your DM can, of course, or if you're a DM, you can allow a player to kind of draw fire. So if you're fighting unintelligent monsters and, the fighter runs up and starts, smacking them, they're unintelligent monsters are not going to ignore the fighter smacking them and run off to go after the wizard way in the back, unless the wizard somehow does something to directly and clearly provoke them. Now, interestingly, probably the most consistent way to generate aggro in the game is being a caster, because pretty much anyone who's ever played D&D for a bit, kind of the mantra is kill casters first. So someone ironically, a caster like a wizard would probably be drawing the most aggro because every intelligent enemy would want to deal with them first. So essentially in terms of aggro, vanilla D&D doesn't have much in terms of guaranteeing that you're going to be pulling all the fire. In terms of kind of general convention, most intelligent monsters will want to go after the caster. And DMs often have to kind of play someone unrealistically, because otherwise everything would just focus fire on, say, the wizard and take them down, and that's not a lot of fun. And so aggro, kind of difficult, unless you can work with your DM to get them to sort of focus stuff on you without killing you, which takes us to survival. So in order to like tank properly, you got to not die. And this requires surviving. The biggest thing is having lots of hit points. That's important because the more hit points you got, the more damage you can take before you die. In terms of the classes that do that kind of well, obviously like fighter and barbarian, lots of hit points. But even something like a wizard or sorcerer can have decent hit points, and you can augment that with magic. Probably something like False Life, generally not like a super great spell. You're kind of better using your first level slot for say shield, but you can get more hit points that way. So hit points, good to have. Always good to have for everybody. Whether you're a tank or not dying, good. The next thing is avoidance, because if you just don't get hit or affected, you take no damage, which is, great. That's kind of the goal. And this is done by such things as having a high armor class. Now, it used to be back in, as I mentioned, my AD&D comparison, that fighters had the best armor. But currently, like a wizard, you could get proficiency in heavy armor by taking one level in fighter, because I guess then you're technically a fighter, or like through a feat or species or race or something, all kinds of options. And so you could have really good armor class. In fact, as a wizard, you could have, or class that can cast shield, you could have like the best armor class, because shield, it's +5 to your armor class. So you could be a wizard, with plate, shield, casting shield. And you have, right out of the box, so to speak, you'd have that, assuming, no magic armor or shield, you could have a 25 armor class, which would make you pretty hard to hit. The second thing is saves. Saves help you avoid damage, because some spells are, damage or full or none. And so the better your saves, the better your chance of not dying. And the class generally with the best saves is paladins. If you're a pure paladin, you get that bonus. And so paladins in that regard, good saving tanks, or people happen to be close to paladins because they can share their bonus. Also for avoidance, imposing disadvantage on the enemy. And this can be done in various ways, like knocking them down, perhaps improved invisibility, blur. And this is often something that works well for, not surprisingly, casters, because you could, if you wanted to, have blur going. It's generally a bad idea to be in melee, as a caster for various reasons, but you could have something like blur going or improved invisibility. Then there's mitigation. Mitigation takes place like after you get hit to lower the sting of the hit. And this can involve resistance, which is good. You take half damage, and this can be acquired through typically like your species. You might, if you're like, for example, an Azamar, or however the hell that's pronounced, you have resistance to necrotic and radiant damage, which is good. If you're tiefling, typically you'd have resistance to fire damage, and you can get resistance to your class. Like if you're a barbarian, and you're raging, you get resistance. And resistance is good for surviving. Taking half damage, good. Saving throws can also help with mitigation. Some spells are, half damage on save, and so good saves means less damage. And again, paladins, really good at saving throws. For healing can also mitigate, because you're taking damage, but you can heal up. And generally, as we'll see when we talk about healer, healing, unless it's to get someone up who's at 0, and you can't help yourself in this case, generally not the best, unless you can somehow heal at very low cost. For example, the fighter's second wind is good here, because it's a bonus action. You just boom, and he gets a few hit points back. But in general, you're not going to be able to like typically out heal as a tank the damage coming in. Sort of weirdly, kind of the best class for tanking, for getting aggro, for drawing like people's attention, adequate hit points, good avoidance, really good mitigation would probably be the wizard, with maybe a dip into fighter. But any class could kind of, it can have decent armor and decent hit points can try to do this. Paladins, of course, really good. Do you need a tank? No. I mean, obviously D&D is not, World of Warcraft. It's not like you can't go into the dungeon without a tank, and it's in way hard to tank. So in terms of using kind of the tank role, if you want to have a character that's good at not dying, then looking at those factors and when building your character obviously would be things you'd want to look at, which you probably already do if you've been playing a while. You want to have good hit points. You want to decide like, okay, how do I avoid getting killed? How do I avoid damage? I want to get a good armor class, good saves, have various things I can do to impose disadvantage. If I'm going to get hit, I want to have various, tactics for mitigation. And that's a good, obviously a good play style. Don't die. So healer role. Healing, of course, in D&D, in this edition, really only two things that are really kind of like viable. One is healing word or similar, where someone gets dropped or death, they're at 0, and boom, healing word, and they're back up. Takes you that it's a quick cast, and it lifts them up from 0, and they get back into the fight so they can take another hit. And if you're making an enemy use, say, their action to take down the person you brought up with healing word, that's a good trade. But other spells, they don't heal enough. You can't, as everyone knows in D&D, you can't outpace damage. It's always going to come in, more damage comes in than the healing you put out, and you're pretty much always, except for the healing word, better off just casting some other spell doing something, because if you kill your enemies or incapacitate them, they're not going to be hurting your party. So the best healing is, killing the enemy. Now, the one exception is the heal spell, because that can dump a ton of hit points into one of your party members, and it'll take a long time, hopefully, for the enemy to chew through that. So in terms of the healer role, you could play that. I mean, I've been playing D&D a long time, and every time I either play or run the game, it always comes up, okay, we need a healer, and we need a healer. And that's true. You do kind of need healing word, but in terms of the healer role, if you build your character around just healing, and you're just like spending all your time in combat doing that, it's probably going to be a bit frustrating, because you'll take your whole action, cast Cure Wounds on somebody, heal them a few hit points, they get smacked with a longsword, or something big hits them like a dragon bite, and all that healing is gone. And so you might feel kind of ineffective. Now, healing, of course, can also include the buffing spells like, for example, Bless, which is incredible, the useful spell. Also in combat, you get like conditions, or what they call in MMOs like debuffs. You might get blinded or stunned or poisoned, and removing those also really important. And those can be things that are fun to do in the game because you're playing an important role and useful, but they tend to be somewhat rare in terms of debuffs. I mean, it does happen, but typically if another player gets like stunned or something, then your best bet may be to just, unless they're just incredibly important to the fight, your best bet is like killing whatever's trying to, whatever stunned them, for example. But there can be key moments where removing a debuff or applying a buff can make an important difference. Best class for healer, probably cleric, because they're, druid can also slot in here. But in terms of the sort of like healer role, you'd kind of want at least one person, maybe two in the party, that could throw out a healing word. That could be cleric, that could be bard, or pretty much anyone who takes like the magic initiate feat and picks like that spell. So this role is not like it is in MMOs, where your survival depends on having a healer pumping constant healing as the monsters chew up your tank. In D&D, unless you create your own set of rules and change healing dramatically, you're not going to be able to do that. So if you're thinking of going in, I'm going to be the healer, I'm going to keep the tank up, unless the game is done the special rules, you're generally not going to be able to do that until you get the spell heal, and then you can kind of do that role, because then you can, boom, here's a whole bunch of hit points. So healer role, you'd want someone who can do healing word, and it's really good to have someone who can heal and do buffs and debuffs. But the healer role, not really a thing in normal D&D. So damage. In D&D, there's primarily the range damage, well, with weapons, using bows, and everyone seems to really love hand crossbows or big crossbows. Then there's melee, where you're smacking things with weapons or your fists. And those tend to be, martial stuff. Because if you're like a wizard and you're smacking something with a stick, things have gone probably terribly wrong. Range seems to be much better in the current version of D&D than melee, at least according to the optimizers. But melee, of course, perfectly viable. The character swinging a greatsword works just fine in most games. Magic, of course, is kind of the big damage, because you can do Air of Effect, which is something that you really can't do with weapons. If you get a crossbow, you're just going to be shooting, one bolt, one target. If you're stabbing with your sword, one stab, one target. I mean, there are like exceptions that exist, but for the most part, if you're going to hit a lot of stuff, which is the way to shut down fights through damage quickly, is if you hit a lot of stuff, enemies, AoE, boom, spread the damage love. And casters, of course, are the best at this. There are, of course, also single target spells, things like cantrips, guiding bolt, disintegrate, which can be good too against the boss fights. So damage is kind of the role now in Dungeons and Dragons, because tanking, you want to survive, but tanking is really not a thing. You don't need someone, it's really, they're not going to be able to draw that damage. Healing, yeah, you want some, but that's not not something you have to devote your character to. But for the most part, damage is the way to go. As people, say, damage solves the problems, fixes the encounters. Probably the best class for this is, again, Wizard. Super powerful class. They can do, the big damage AoE. They can do single target damage. They've got incredible survivability. I mean, again, in previous editions, the idea of like the wizard and cloth, a monster will run up and just like kill them. But now you can, as I noted before in my earlier video, you can be a wizard wearing full plate, carrying a shield. You can have an armor class of, 20 plus, throwing up shield when things try to hit you. You're tossing out fireballs. You're just wrecking everything. But any class can be viable. It all depends on what the campaign's like, what your DM's like. Any class can be fun. But in terms of if you're going to like optimize, Wizard is super good. And of course you can build all these, cobble together nightmare chimeras of, merging of various, classes and feats and stuff to make these truly terrifying damage machines. If you're into optimization, which is fine. Playstyle of optimization where you want to build like a super min-max and murder machine, that's cool. As long as it's fun for everybody at the table, min-max murder all the way. All right, so as a quick recap, tanking doesn't really work that well in D&D. You might be able to get your DM to cooperate by having a character, say, especially like a paladin who wants to protect the party, to be able through like role playing and stuff to kind of like draw some of the fire. Healing, you just want to go for, do we have healing word? Can we remove like curse? Can we deal with things like poison? Then you're fine. You don't need like a cleric totally built around healing, unless you want to do that, unless that's fun. And damage is good for everybody. So that's always a good build. So survive, damage the enemy. All right, so stay safe, and I'll see you in the dungeon in the future. Until next time, goodbye.